The leather folder hit the mahogany table with a sound that felt like a door closing forever. Connor Hayes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay, his reflection ghost-like against the glass, a man who had rebuilt an empire but somewhere along the way had lost himself in the architecture of it. Behind him, his uncle's voice carved through the silence of the Miami boardroom like a blade through silk. "This is not negotiable, Connor." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished wood, and Connor watched them stretch toward him like fingers reaching for something he had sworn he would never give again. His knuckles whitened around the pen in his hand, the same hand that had signed 100 contracts, built a fortune from his father's ashes, and 4 years ago had reached for a woman who chose someone else's money over his heart. The contract waited. Black ink, white paper, one signature between duty and desire. "When do I meet her?" he asked, his voice flat as the bay outside. "You don't. Not until the wedding day." Connor's breath caught, just for a second, before he pressed the pen to paper. A marriage to a stranger. Exactly what a man who no longer believed in love deserved. But as the ink dried, something whispered in the part of himself he kept locked away. What if? To my viewers in Australia, the Philippines, the United States, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, Nigeria, the United Kingdom, and Canada, your loyalty, strength, and spirit have built the foundation of this channel. Every view, comment, and share is a heartbeat in this story we're building together. You didn't just keep the channel alive, you kept me alive too. With all my heart, thank you. The Glided Heart Stories creator. Let us now begin our story. The contract sat on Connor's nightstand like an accusation. Morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, turning Biscayne Bay into liquid gold, but Connor felt none of its warmth. He had been awake since 4 a.m., staring at the ceiling, then at the contract, then at the photo he kept face down in his desk drawer, the one he told himself he had thrown away years ago. He pulled the drawer open now, his hand steadier than it should have been. Victoria smiled up at him from the photograph, her arm looped through his at some charity gala he could barely remember. She had worn red that night. He had thought she was beautiful. He had thought she was his. "I'm sorry, Connor, but he can offer me more." Her voice still lived somewhere in his chest, not loud, but persistent, like the hum of electricity through walls. She had said it so simply, as if love were a bid at an auction and someone else had raised the price. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with cruelty, but with something worse. Pity. That was the moment Connor Hayes stopped believing in things that couldn't be measured, controlled, or contracted. He slid the photo back into the drawer and closed it with a soft click. By mid-morning, his penthouse had become a staging ground for someone else's vision of his future. Wedding planners moved through the space with military efficiency, rolling in racks of suits, carrying binders thick as textbooks, speaking in languages he didn't care to learn, boutonnieres and tablescapes and seasonal palettes. A tailor pinned fabric to his shoulders while talking about Italian wool. A florist debated the symbolic difference between orchids and gardenias. Someone asked him to taste 3 different shades of white cake. They all tasted like ash. His assistant, Martin, stood near the kitchen island reading from a leather portfolio. "The terms are clear, Mr. Hayes. 5 public appearances minimum. The Whitmore Gala. The charity auction. The—" "I know the terms," Connor said, his voice flat. "I signed them." "Yes, sir." Martin hesitated. "And the bride has been informed of the same conditions. 1 year. Complete discretion. No expectations beyond what's necessary for appearances." No expectations. The words should have been a relief. Instead, They felt like another door closing. Connor watched the wedding planner arrange fabric swatches on his dining table. Ivory, cream, pearl, champagne, all variations of white that looked identical to him. She held them up to the light as if they held some profound meaning, as if the difference between silk and satin could somehow define what a marriage should feel like. He thought about his father then, about the last conversation they'd had in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying hope. "Promise me, son," his father had whispered, his hand weak in Connor's. "Protect the family legacy, whatever it costs." Connor had promised. He always kept his promises, even when they cost him everything. 3 days before the wedding, Connor drove to Woodlawn Cemetery in Little Havana. The afternoon heat pressed down like a weight, making the air shimmer above the gravestones. Connor walked the familiar path to his father's plot, past marble angels and weathered crosses, until he reached the simple headstone that bore his father's name. Robert James Hayes. Beloved father. Visionary leader. 1958 to 2021. Connor knelt and placed his hand flat against the warm stone, feeling the grooves of each etched letter beneath his palm. His father had built Hayes Property Group from scratch, a small construction company that evolved into an empire. He had sacrificed everything: time, health, peace. And when cancer came for him, he had used his last breaths to make Connor promise to keep that empire alive. "I'm doing what you asked," Connor said quietly, his voice swallowed by the cemetery's silence. "I'm protecting the legacy." A breeze moved through the palm trees overhead, rustling the fronds. "But I don't know if you'd recognize what I've become." The stone had no answer. It never did. Connor stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and walked back to his car. The wedding was in 3 days. The bride was a stranger. The future was a contract. And somewhere, buried so deep he almost couldn't feel it anymore, was the man he used to be, the one who believed love was more than a transaction. That night, Martin delivered a slim folder to Connor's penthouse. "Information on the bride, as requested," Martin said. Though there wasn't much available. Connor opened it after Martin left. Brenda Williams, age 28, architect. A single professional headshot showed a woman with dark eyes and a reserved smile, the kind of smile people wore for cameras, not for joy. The rest of the file was sparse. Education: University of Miami, School of Architecture. Employment history: scattered, unexplained gaps. No social media presence. No digital footprint beyond the bare minimum. It was as if she had tried to disappear. Connor searched for her online himself, laptop open on the kitchen counter at midnight. He found a few mentions in community newsletters. Brenda Williams presents design proposal for community center renovation. A photo from a local event showed her standing beside an elderly woman, both of them smiling in front of a building with a hand-painted sign, "Over Town Community Center." Why would an architect with a degree from a prestigious university agree to an arranged marriage? The question followed him to bed and waited for him in the dark. And in the silence before sleep, another question surfaced, one he didn't expect. What is she running from? The Vizcaya Museum and Gardens looked like something pulled from a dream, or a memory of a world that no longer existed. Connor arrived for the wedding rehearsal 2 days before the ceremony, stepping out of his car into the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and alive. The estate stretched before him. Spanish Renaissance architecture wrapped in tropical gardens, stone terraces overlooking Biscayne Bay, fountains that whispered in the afternoon stillness. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost mocking, all this elegance for a marriage built on paperwork. He walked through the main courtyard, past marble columns and manicured hedges, his mind elsewhere. The file on Brenda Williams sat like an unfinished sentence in his thoughts. Architect. Community center. Unexplained gaps. Pieces that didn't form a picture. He turned a corner near the East Loggia and nearly collided with someone. A woman carrying a large box of decorations stumbled back, the box tilting dangerously in her arms. Connor reached out instinctively, steadying it before anything could fall. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice soft, slightly breathless, with a hint of a southern lilt that reminded him of summer evenings and places he'd never been. She kept her head down, adjusting her grip on the box. Connor caught only a glimpse, dark curls pulled back, slim shoulders, hands that trembled slightly despite her effort to appear composed. "It's fine," he said. "Are you?" But she was already moving, slipping past him toward a side entrance with practiced efficiency, as if disappearing were something she'd learned to do well. Connor stood there for a moment longer than he should have, watching the door close behind her. Something about her presence lingered in the air, not perfume but something warmer. The gentleness in her apology. The determination in the way she moved despite obvious nerves. And something else he couldn't name, a familiarity that made no sense, like hearing a song he'd forgotten he knew. Why does she feel known? He shook the thought away and continued to the rehearsal. But the question followed him like a shadow. That night, Connor couldn't sleep. His penthouse felt too big, too quiet, filled with furniture that looked expensive but didn't feel like home. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and stood at the windows overlooking the city. Miami glittered below, 1,000 lives happening simultaneously, none of them his. He opened his laptop. The search began simply, Brenda Williams Architect Miami. But the sparse results from before now felt insufficient, incomplete. He dug deeper, clicking through archives, community newsletters, property records, anything that might explain why a 28-year-old architect would agree to marry a stranger. And then he found it. Overtown Community Center faces foreclosure. Families fear losing safe haven. The article was 6 months old, buried in the community section of the Miami Herald. Connor read it twice, slowly, letting the details settle. The center had been serving predominantly black families in Overtown for 30 years. After-school programs, job training, meals for seniors, a safe space in a neighborhood that had been systematically neglected. The founder, Dorothy Williams, had personally guaranteed the mortgage. When she fell ill and could no longer work, the payments stopped. The bank was foreclosing. Connor clicked to the photo gallery. There she was. Brenda Williams stood in front of the center, surrounded by children, her smile genuine in a way her professional headshot hadn't been. Her eyes, dark, warm, determined, looked directly at the camera. She wore a simple dress and held a child's hand, and there was something in her expression that Connor recognized because he'd felt it himself, the weight of carrying something too heavy alone. He scrolled through more images. Brenda at a community meeting, presenting architectural plans. Brenda painting a mural with teenagers. Brenda standing beside an older woman who had to be her mother, the same woman from the earlier photo, both of them in front of the center's hand-painted sign. Another article, more recent, local architect abandons career, future unclear. The pieces still didn't fit, but a picture was forming, blurry, incomplete, but undeniably human. Why would she give up her career? What does this have to do with an arranged marriage? Connor closed the laptop, but sleep didn't come. The questions multiplied in the dark. The next day, Connor returned to Vizcaya for final preparations. He walked through the gardens where the ceremony would take place, past the altar being constructed beneath a canopy of white orchids and palm fronds. Wedding planners moved with choreographed precision, adjusting chairs, testing sound systems, transforming the space into something that would photograph well. Connor stood at the back, watching, feeling like a spectator at his own life. Completely overwhelmed, a voice drifted from behind a nearby hedge. I went to check on her this morning, and she was crying in the preparation room. Connor stopped walking. Two wedding planners stood on the other side of the hedge, clipboards in hand, speaking in hushed tones they thought were private. "The bride?" the second planner asked. "Yes." She could barely breathe. Kept saying she has no choice, that this is the only way. I've never seen someone look so trapped at their own wedding. Poor thing. Do you know why she's doing this? No idea. But whatever it is, it must be desperate. Their voices faded as they moved away, but the words remained, echoing in Connor's chest with unexpected force. She has no choice. This is the only way. He had spent days thinking of this marriage as a business transaction. Clean, controlled, mutually beneficial in its coldness. But standing there, hearing the fear in a stranger's voice described secondhand, something shifted. She wasn't a contract. She was a person. And she was just as trapped as he was. Connor's hand curled into a fist at his side, not from anger, but from something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt uncomfortably like empathy, or concern, or the first crack in walls he'd spent 4 years building. That night, alone in his penthouse, Connor did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, not the one with Victoria's photo, but the one beneath it. The one that held things he'd kept but never looked at. Old letters, ticket stubs, a watch his father had given him, and beneath it all, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. Hurricane Irma heroes, strangers who became saviors. Connor unfolded it carefully, as if it might disintegrate under too much pressure. The article detailed stories of ordinary people who had helped during the hurricane's aftermath. Neighbors rescuing neighbors. Volunteers pulling people from flooded homes. And at the bottom, a grainy photo. Rescue workers on a rain-soaked street, faces blurred by motion and weather. Connor had been one of the people rescued that night. 4 years ago. Hurricane Irma had hit Miami with biblical fury. Connor had been driving back from a site inspection in Coral Gables when the storm surge came faster than predicted. His car hydroplaned, spun, crashed into a retention wall. Water rose around him, dark and relentless. He couldn't get the door open, couldn't breathe, couldn't. And then there was a voice. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay. I promise. Just stay with me." A woman. She had appeared through the storm like something impossible, pulling his door open with strength that defied her size, dragging him from the vehicle before it was completely submerged. She'd held him up, kept him conscious, refused to leave even when the wind howled and the rain came sideways. He never learned her name. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone, disappeared back into the storm to help someone else. But he remembered her eyes. Dark, determined, impossibly kind. And her voice, soft, with a southern lilt that had somehow cut through the chaos and made him believe he might survive. Connor stared at the blurred photo in the newspaper clipping, at a figure that could have been anyone. Or could have been her. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Martin. Final details confirmed. Ceremony at 4 p.m. tomorrow. The bride will arrive separately. Connor set the phone down and looked back at the clipping. Somewhere in Miami, a woman named Brenda Williams was preparing to marry a stranger to save something she loved. And somewhere in Connor's memory, a voice from a hurricane whispered, I promise. Just stay with me. The wedding was tomorrow, and Connor had the strangest, most impossible feeling that he'd met his bride before. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it felt like a lie. Connor woke before dawn, his body tense with something that wasn't quite dread but wasn't anticipation either. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something irreversible, a moment that would split his life into before and after, whether he wanted it to or not. He showered in silence, dressed in the clothes laid out by the stylist, and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back appeared composed, controlled, every inch the CEO who had rebuilt an empire from ash. But his eyes told a different story, one of questions that had kept him awake, circling like birds that couldn't find a place to land. What if it's her? The thought was absurd. Miami had millions of people. The chances of the woman from the hurricane being the same woman he was about to marry were astronomical. Impossible, the kind of coincidence that only happened in stories people told to make sense of chaos. And yet, Connor couldn't shake the memory of that voice in the storm, or the way the woman at Vizcaya had moved. That same determined grace, that same gentle strength. His phone buzzed. Martin. Car arriving in 15 minutes. Connor picked up his jacket, slid it on, and took one last look at the penthouse, the space he'd built to prove he needed nothing and no one. Then he walked out the door. Vizcaya had been transformed. White flowers cascaded from every archway and column, their fragrance thick in the afternoon heat. String lights would illuminate the ceremony at dusk, but for now, natural light filtered through palm fronds and ancient trees, dappling everything in gold and shadow. Chairs lined the stone terrace in perfect rows, facing an altar draped in silk and orchids. It looked like a wedding. It felt like a stage. Connor entered through a side entrance, guided by wedding coordinators who spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if the ceremony were a sacred thing instead of a business transaction. They led him to a preparation room overlooking the gardens, a space with too much elegance and not enough air. The ceremony begins in 2 hours, Mr. Hayes, the coordinator said, adjusting the small microphone beneath his lapel. You'll enter first, take your position at the altar, and wait for the bride. She'll be escorted by her mother. Connor nodded, barely hearing. And Mr. Hayes? The coordinator hesitated. The bride requested a moment alone before the processional. She's understandably nervous. Understandably nervous. The phrase seemed inadequate for what Connor had heard described. A woman crying in preparation rooms, saying she had no choice. Is she all right? The question came out before Connor could stop it. The coordinator looked surprised that he'd asked. She's managing. This is difficult for everyone involved. After the coordinator left, Connor stood at the window, watching final preparations below. Guests were beginning to arrive. Board members, investors, family he barely spoke to, people who would witness a marriage and call it tradition when it was really just leverage. Then he heard voices from the adjacent corridor. A door slightly ajar. 2 women speaking in tones meant to be private but carried by the acoustic quirk of old architecture. Brenda, you're shaking. Here, drink some water. I can't, Mama. I can't do this. I can't. Baby girl, breathe. Just breathe. He doesn't even know me. What if he's cruel? What if? You're doing this for the center, for the community, for all those families who need that space. You're stronger than you know. A sound like a sob being swallowed. I wish Daddy were here. I know, baby. I know. But he'd be so proud of you. You're saving what he built. You're saving all of us. Silence. Then a younger voice, steadier. You don't owe me an explanation. I just needed you to know you're not alone. I'm here. Maya's here. We're all here. Connor stepped back from the window, the conversation settling in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for her family, for a community center her father had built, for people who depended on a space that was about to be taken away. Just like Connor was doing this for his father's legacy, for a company that bore his family's name, for a promise made in a hospital room that smelled of death and disinfectant. They were both trapped by love, just different kinds. Connor's hands, which had been steady all morning, began to tremble. At 3:45 p.m., a coordinator knocked softly on Connor's door. "It's time, Mr. Hayes." Connor adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit from a man who didn't get nervous, and followed her into the corridor. The hallway stretched long and quiet, leading to the double doors that would open onto the ceremony. On the other side, he could hear the string quartet beginning, the soft murmur of guests settling into their seats. He paused at the threshold. Across the hallway, another door opened, and she appeared. The bride emerged flanked by two attendants who fussed with the long train of her ivory dress. The veil covered her completely, layers of delicate lace that concealed everything but the outline of her form. She moved slowly, carefully, her hands clutched tightly around a bouquet of white gardenias. She didn't see Connor. The attendants guided her toward the opposite entrance, the one that would bring her down the aisle after he had taken his position. But Connor saw her, saw the way her shoulders rose and fell with uneven breaths, saw the tremor in her hands despite her effort to appear calm, saw the way she paused for just a moment, as if gathering courage from some invisible source. And he wanted, desperately, to say something, to cross the hallway and tell her, what? That he understood. That she wasn't alone in this cage they'd both agreed to enter? But the coordinator was already opening his doors. "Mr. Hayes, please." The music swelled. The guests rose. Connor walked forward into the light. The ceremony space had been transformed into something from a dream. Rows of guests in elegant attire. Garlands of white orchids and roses cascading from the altar canopy. The late afternoon sun filtering through palm fronds, creating patterns of light and shadow on the stone terrace. Biscayne Bay glittered in the distance, oblivious and eternal. Connor walked down the aisle with measured steps, aware of every eye on him, aware of the weight of expectation pressing down like humidity. He reached the altar and turned, taking his position beneath the canopy of flowers. The officiant stood beside him, an older man with kind eyes who probably believed this was a love story. The string quartet shifted to a new melody, Pachelbel's canon. The processional. Every guest turned toward the doors at the far end of the terrace. Connor's heart, which had been steady through board meetings and hostile takeovers and his father's death, began to beat irregularly. The doors opened, and she appeared. Two attendants entered first, carrying the edges of her train. Then the bride stepped into view, her mother beside her, the same older woman from the photos Connor had seen online, her face a mixture of pride and sorrow. But Connor barely saw anyone else. The bride moved slowly down the aisle, the ivory dress catching the dappled sunlight like water, the veil flowing behind her like something sacred. Her hands gripped the bouquet so tightly that Connor could see the tension even from a distance. She was small, smaller than he'd imagined, but there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of strength, of someone who had learned to carry weight she shouldn't have to bear. With each step closer, Connor's breathing grew more shallow. There was something about her movement, the way she walked, the grace despite obvious fear. Why does she feel so familiar? She reached the altar steps. Her mother kissed her Veek through the veil and stepped back. The bride stood alone now, just one step below Connor, close enough for him to hear her uneven breathing beneath the lace. His instinct, trained by years of control, was to say nothing, to remain composed, to let the ceremony proceed according to plan. But something else rose in him, something human. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Take your time." Beneath the veil, her breath caught, a small, sharp inhale of surprise. She nodded, just barely, and Connor saw her shoulders release a fraction of their tension. For one fleeting moment, it felt like the only honest thing that had happened all day. The officiant cleared his throat gently and began. "Dearly beloved, we gather here today to witness the union of Connor James Hayes and Brenda Marie Williams in matrimony. A commitment made before family, before community, before all that we hold sacred." The words washed over Connor, familiar and meaningless, a script performed 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 ceremonies just like this one. But his attention remained fixed on the woman standing before him, on the way her hands trembled around the gardenia bouquet, on the rapid rise and fall of her breath beneath silk and lace, on the impossible, undeniable feeling that this moment mattered more than any contract could define. The officiant continued. "Marriage is a sacred bond, built not only on obligation but on trust, on faith, on the courage to stand together even when the future is uncertain." Connor almost laughed at the irony. Trust, faith, courage. They were marrying for money and legacy and promises made to the dead. And yet, "And now," the officiant said, his voice warm with ceremonial significance, "the bride may lift her veil." The world seemed to slow. The guests leaned forward slightly, curiosity barely masked by politeness. The string quartet fell silent. Even the breeze through the palm trees seemed to pause. Brenda's hands rose slowly, trembling fingers catching the edge of the delicate lace. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and in that pause, Connor realized he was holding his breath. She lifted the veil. The lace drifted upward, catching the golden afternoon light, revealing her face inch by inch. And Connor's entire world stopped. It was her. Dark eyes. Warm, determined, impossibly kind. The same eyes that had looked at him through the chaos of a hurricane and promised he wouldn't die alone. The same eyes he'd spent 4 years trying to forget. Brenda Williams wasn't a stranger. She was the woman who had saved his life. And she was staring at him now with those same eyes, wide, filled with recognition, with fear, with something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. "Hello, Connor," she whispered, her voice so soft only he could hear. The voice from the storm. The voice that had pulled him back from drowning. Connor couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there as every wall he'd built, every defense he'd constructed, every lie he'd told himself about not believing in fate, all of it shattered. The officiant was saying something. The guests were watching. The ceremony was moving forward. But Connor Hayes, the man who controlled everything, who left nothing to chance, who had signed a contract for a loveless marriage, he was undone. Because the universe had just given him back the one person who had shown him that humanity still existed. And she was about to become his wife. Connor couldn't look away. The world had narrowed to Brenda's face. Those dark eyes that had haunted him for 4 years, now staring back at him with the same mixture of shock and recognition he felt burning in his own chest. Around them, the ceremony continued like a machine set in motion, unstoppable, but neither of them seemed to hear it. The officiant's voice drifted through the air. "Connor James Hayes, do you take this woman?" But Connor was somewhere else. He was in a flooded street with water rising past his waist, lungs burning, vision blurring. He was hearing her voice cut through the storm. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay. I promise." He was remembering how she'd refused to leave even when the wind threatened to pull them both under. How she'd held his face in her hands and forced him to focus on her eyes instead of the chaos. How she'd stayed until the ambulance came, then disappeared into the storm like something he'd imagined. To have and to hold from this day forward. Brenda's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Her hands gripped the bouquet so tightly the stems might break. A single tear traced down her cheek, catching the golden light. Connor's throat tightened. "Mr. Hayes," the officiant prompted gently. Connor blinked, pulled back into the present. Every guest was watching. His uncle sat in the front row with an expression of careful neutrality. Board members waited with held breath. This was the moment everything depended on, the signature becoming flesh, the contract becoming binding. He looked at Brenda again. Really looked at her. She wasn't just the woman from the hurricane. She was the woman who'd given up her career, who'd agreed to marry a stranger to save a community center her father had built, who stood here now, terrified but unbroken, carrying a weight that would have crushed most people. She was brave in ways he'd forgotten how to be. "I do," Connor said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside him. Relief flickered across Brenda's face, quickly hidden behind composure. The officiant turned to her. "And do you, Brenda Marie Williams, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Brenda's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I do." The words felt more real than any signature. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The officiant smiled. "You may kiss the bride." The moment hung suspended. Connor hadn't thought about this part. The performance of intimacy, the public declaration of something that was supposed to be private. His instinct was to make it brief, perfunctory, to get through it and move on. But as he stepped closer to Brenda, as he saw the fear and vulnerability in her eyes, something shifted in him. This woman had saved his life without asking for anything in return. The least he could do was not make her feel alone in this moment. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he gently touched her cheek, just his fingertips, barely there, and leaned in. The kiss was soft, brief, nothing more than a whisper of contact. But Connor felt it like lightning. When he pulled back, Brenda's eyes were wide, her breath unsteady. For just a second, the fear in her expression had been replaced by something else. Surprise. Maybe wonder. Maybe recognition of the same impossible thing Connor was feeling. Applause erupted around them, polite, measured, appropriate for a merger disguised as a marriage. But Connor barely heard it. The receiving line was a blur of congratulations that felt like interrogations. Connor and Brenda stood side by side at the entrance to the reception hall, shaking hands with guests who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Business associates who wanted to know if this meant the Whitmore merger was secure. Family members who made pointed comments about finally settling down. Board members who assessed Brenda like an asset on a balance sheet. Through it all, Connor kept one hand at the small of Brenda's back, not possessive but protective. He could feel her trembling beneath the silk of her dress. "Congratulations, Connor," his uncle said, gripping his hand firmly. "I knew you'd make the right choice." The right choice. As if there had been a choice at all. His uncle turned to Brenda with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Hayes." "Thank you," Brenda said softly, her southern accent more pronounced under stress. When his uncle moved on, Brenda exhaled slowly. "How many more?" "Too many," Connor murmured. "But we can take a break whenever you need." She glanced up at him, surprised. "You don't have to." "Yes," Connor said quietly. "I do." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that they were in this together now, whether they'd chosen it or not. The reception hall glowed with chandeliers and candlelight. White orchids cascaded from tall centerpieces. A live band played jazz standards that nobody was dancing to yet. Servers in white gloves circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked like art but tasted like obligation. Connor guided Brenda to the head table, pulling out her chair before sitting beside her. Up close, without the veil between them, he could see the details he'd missed, the exhaustion beneath her makeup, the way she held herself with careful control, like someone who'd learned that showing weakness invited exploitation. "Are you all right?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. Brenda nodded, but her hands twisted in her lap. "I didn't expect." She stopped, started again. "It's you. After all this time, it's you." "I know." Connor's throat felt tight. "I searched for you. After the hurricane. But I didn't know your name. I didn't know how to find you." "I tried to find you too," Brenda said. "All I knew was your first name and that you worked in real estate. Do you know how many Connors work in Miami real estate?" Despite everything, Connor almost smiled. "A lot. A lot," she confirmed. A pause. "When I saw your full name on the marriage contract, I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe it was fate. Or a cosmic joke." "Maybe both," Connor said. Brenda looked at him fully then, and Connor saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. "Why did you agree to this?" she said. "The marriage. A man like you could have." "Could have what?" "Found someone who loved me." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "Love is a liability in my world." This made more sense. A partnership with clear terms. No illusions. No betrayals. Brenda's expression softened with something that looked like recognition. "You sound like someone who's been hurt before." Connor didn't answer. He didn't have to. "I'm sorry," Brenda said quietly. "Don't be. I made my choices." He glanced at her. "What about you? Why did you agree?" Brenda's hands stilled in her lap. "My mother's community center. It was my father's legacy. After he died, we couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. The bank was foreclosing. When your uncle's lawyers approached us with the offer, marry you, receive enough money to save the center and keep it running for years," her voice cracked slightly. "I couldn't let it disappear. I couldn't let everyone down." "So you gave up everything," Connor said. "Your career, your freedom, your future." "Not everything," Brenda said. "I still have my family, the community. That's what matters." Connor studied her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the strength in her eyes despite the trembling hands. She reminded him of the woman in the hurricane, terrified but refusing to give up, choosing to save others even when she was barely surviving herself. "You're extraordinary," he said before he could stop himself. Brenda turned to him, startled. "I'm not. I'm just." "You pulled a stranger from a flooded car during a hurricane," Connor interrupted. "You sacrificed your career to save a community center. You married someone you didn't know to protect your family. That's the definition of extraordinary. Color rose in Brenda's cheeks. You defended me to your uncle earlier. Even though you just met me. That's what anyone should do, Connor finished. But not what everyone does, Brenda said softly. Their eyes held for a moment too long. Around them, the reception continued. Guests laughing, glasses clinking, the performance of celebration. But in their small bubble at the head table, something else was happening. Something neither of them had expected. Connection. A server approached, breaking the moment. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, we're ready for your first dance. Brenda's eyes widened slightly. I forgot about that. Connor stood and extended his hand. We don't have to if you don't want to. But Brenda placed her hand in his, and Connor felt that same jolt of recognition. Skin touching skin, the physical confirmation that this was real, she was real, this impossible coincidence was actually happening. He led her to the dance floor as the band began playing a slow melody Connor didn't recognize. The guests formed a circle around them, phones raised to capture the moment for social media and posterity. Connor placed one hand at Brenda's waist, the other holding hers gently. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, and they began to move. I'm not a very good dancer, Brenda whispered. Neither am I, Connor admitted. But we just have to make it through one song. They swayed together, finding a rhythm that was slightly offbeat but somehow worked. Connor was acutely aware of how close she was, close enough to smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of the gardens at Vizcaya. Close enough to feel her heartbeat through the thin silk of her dress. Connor! Brenda's voice was barely audible over the music. Yes. What happens now? After tonight? It was the question Connor had been avoiding. The contract stipulated appearances, public events, a year of pretending. But standing here with Brenda in his arms, her question felt like it was asking something deeper. I don't know, Connor said honestly. The contract says one thing, but... He trailed off, unsure how to finish. But... Brenda prompted. Connor met her eyes. But nothing in the contract accounted for this. For you being... you. Brenda's breath hitched slightly. I know what you mean. The song was ending. Around them, guests applauded. The moment was passing, returning them to performance, to expectation, to the roles they'd agreed to play. But as Connor led Brenda back to their table, he realized something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just a contract anymore. This was a choice waiting to be made. And neither of them knew yet what they would choose. The reception had settled into a rhythm of polite conversation and champagne when the doors at the far end of the hall opened with enough force to turn heads. Connor felt Brenda stiffen beside him before he saw who had entered. A young woman stood in the doorway, breathless, her dress wrinkled as if she'd been traveling for hours. She was younger than Brenda, early 20s, maybe, with the same dark eyes and determined expression. But where Brenda carried her strength quietly, this woman wore hers like armor. Maya, Brenda whispered, the color draining from her face. What are you doing here? The woman, Maya, Connor realized, Brenda's sister, moved through the crowd with purpose. Guests parted instinctively, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in water. The band faltered mid-song, then stopped entirely. I'm sorry, Brenda, Maya said, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry. I can't let you do this without him knowing the truth. Connor stood slowly, every instinct sharpening to attention. Beside him, Brenda's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. Maya, please, Brenda said, desperation cracking through her composure. Don't. But Maya was already speaking, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Connor, Mr. Hayes, you should know the truth about why Brenda agreed to this marriage. The room fell into the kind of silence that feels heavy, suffocating. Even the servers stopped moving, champagne flutes suspended mid-pour. Maya's eyes glistened with tears, but her voice remained steady. My sister didn't choose this for herself. She did it to save our family. Our father, he died 2 years ago. Suddenly. Heart attack. He was only 53. Brenda's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Connor could see her trembling, see her fighting to hold herself together in front of 200 people who were watching her unravel. Maya continued, each word landing like a stone. Before he died, our father ran the Overtown Community Center. He'd built it from nothing 30 years ago, a safe place for families in a neighborhood everyone else had forgotten. He personally guaranteed the mortgage because no bank would take the risk on a community center in Overtown. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. When he died, we couldn't keep up with the payments. My mother got sick from the stress. The bank started foreclosure proceedings. We were going to lose everything. The center, the programs, the only safe space those families had. Connor's uncle shifted in his seat, his expression carefully neutral. But Connor saw the calculation in his eyes, the assessment of whether this revelation was an asset or a liability. Maya's voice broke slightly. So when your family's lawyers came to us with an offer, marry Connor Hayes, receive enough money to save the center and keep it running for years, Brenda didn't hesitate. She gave up her architecture career. She gave up her life. She agreed to marry a stranger because she couldn't bear to let our father's legacy die. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Connor turned to look at Brenda. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked, her carefully constructed composure finally shattered. But even in her breaking, there was dignity. She didn't hide. She didn't run. She simply sat there, exposed and vulnerable, bearing the weight of judgment from people who had never sacrificed anything that mattered. Then the whispers started. A charity case, someone muttered near the back. She was using him for money, another voice hissed. I knew something was off about this marriage. This is what Hayes Property Group has become. Desperate enough to. Each whisper was a blade, and Connor watched them cut into Brenda one by one. Her shoulders shook. Her hands trembled. But she didn't make a sound. And something inside Connor, something that had been dormant for 4 years, buried beneath contracts and calculated decisions and walls built from betrayal, roared to life. A figure stepped forward from the crowd. Derek, Connor's cousin. The board member who had opposed this marriage from the beginning, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Derek's laugh was cold, sharp enough to silence the whispers. So this is what Hayes Property Group has become? He looked around the room, playing to the audience. Charity cases? My cousin, he gestured toward Connor with mock sympathy. Marrying someone who needed a financial bailout. Other board members murmured agreement. Connor saw them calculating, reassessing, wondering if this was the moment to make their move against him. Derek turned to Connor directly, his smile predatory. Quite the investment you've made, cousin. Tell me, was the community center worth your dignity? Worth the company's reputation? The room held its breath. This was the moment. The choice Connor had been avoiding since he'd signed the contract in that boardroom overlooking Biscayne Bay. Protect his position. Maintain distance. Preserve the empire he'd built from his father's ashes. Or protect her. Connor looked at Brenda one more time. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at her hands, at the wedding ring that felt like a shackle, at the ruins of the dignity she'd tried so hard to maintain. And Connor remembered. He remembered a woman appearing through a hurricane, refusing to leave a stranger to drown. He remembered a voice cutting through chaos. Stay with me. You're not alone. I promise. He remembered that this woman, this extraordinary, selfless woman, had saved his life without knowing his name, without wanting anything in return. And he'd be damned if he let these people destroy her for having the courage to save others again. Connor stood slowly, deliberately. The room quieted instantly, every eye turning to him. He stepped in front of Brenda, placing himself between her and the judgment, between her and Derek, between her and every person in this room who had never understood what real sacrifice looked like. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but carried the kind of authority that had built empires and broken competitors. Let me be absolutely clear. The room seemed to lean in. Brenda didn't manipulate anyone. She didn't deceive anyone. She made a decision, a sacrifice, that most people in this room couldn't begin to comprehend. He looked directly at Derek, his gaze hard as steel. She put her community above herself. She gave up her career, her freedom, her future, to save families who had nowhere else to go. To preserve a legacy her father built with his own hands. To protect people whose society had already forgotten. Connor's voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with conviction. And if anyone in this room wants to call that manipulation, or opportunism, or anything other than what it actually is, which is extraordinary courage and selfless love, then you fundamentally misunderstand what character means. He turned slowly, addressing the entire room now. Her past doesn't diminish her place in this family. It proves she belongs here more than most of us ever will. Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably. A board member looked away. Derek's smirk faltered, but he pushed forward. That's very noble, Connor. But the question remains, are you willing to risk everything for her? Your position, the company, the board's confidence. Connor didn't hesitate. Yes, he said simply. I am. The two words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Derek's expression hardened. Then you're a fool. Maybe, Connor said. But I'd rather be a fool with integrity than a success without it. He reached down without breaking eye contact with Derek, found Brenda's hand, and held it firmly. The room erupted in whispers, some shocked, some admiring, some calculating what this meant for alliances and power structures. But Connor didn't care about any of it. He looked down at Brenda. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears, but also with something else. Something that looked like hope breaking through devastation. Can you stand? He asked quietly. She nodded, and he helped her to her feet. Together they walked through the crowd, heads high, hands clasped, toward the terrace doors. People parted for them. Some with respect, some with confusion, some with the dawning realization that they had just witnessed something rare. A man choosing love over legacy, connection over control, humanity over power. As Connor pushed open the doors to the terrace, he heard his uncle's voice behind him, tight with barely controlled anger. Connor, we need to talk about this. Connor paused, looked back over his shoulder. No, he said. We really don't. And he led Brenda out into the night. The terrace air hit them like a blessing. After the suffocating tension of the reception hall, the night felt vast and open. The Miami skyline glowed against a purple twilight, towers of glass and steel reflecting the last traces of sunset. Biscayne Bay stretched dark and infinite beyond the gardens, its surface rippling with city lights. Connor guided Brenda to the stone railing at the terrace's edge, far enough from the reception that the music became a distant hum, the voices reduced to white noise. They stood in the kind of silence that follows storms, heavy with aftermath, uncertain what comes next. Brenda's shoulders shook as the tears she'd been holding back finally broke free. Connor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his handkerchief. Monogrammed, expensive, ridiculous in its formality. He offered it without a word. Brenda took it, pressing it against her eyes as if she could physically stop the flood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out like that. I never wanted." "Don't apologize," Connor said quietly. "You have nothing to apologize for. I humiliated you in front of everyone. The board, the investors, your family." "They humiliated themselves," Connor interrupted. "Not you. Never you." Brenda lowered the handkerchief, looking at him with raw, unguarded eyes. "You defended me. You didn't have to do that. You should have protected your position. But you chose me instead." "Yes," Connor said simply. "I did. Why?" The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Connor was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city he'd conquered but never truly lived in. A city full of buildings he'd developed, deals he'd closed, successes that meant nothing at 3 a.m. when he was alone with his reflection. "Because you didn't deserve what they were doing to you," he said finally. "Because what you did, sacrificing everything for people you love, that's not weakness. It's the kind of strength most people never find." He turned to face her fully. "And because 4 years ago you saved my life. Not because you knew who I was or what I could give you. You saved me because you saw another human being who needed help, and you refused to walk away. Even when it put you in danger. Even when the storm was trying to kill us both." Brenda's breath caught. Fresh tears spilled over, but these felt different. Not shame, but something closer to relief. "I remember everything about that night," she said softly. "The way the wind sounded like it was tearing the world apart. The water rising so fast I thought we'd both drown. Your car, it was already half underwater when I found you. You were trying to break the window, but you couldn't get leverage." Connor's throat tightened at the memory. "I thought I was going to die in that car." "I know," Brenda said. "I could see it in your eyes. You'd already given up. Until you appeared." Connor's voice dropped lower. "I thought you were a hallucination at first. No one in their right mind would have been out in that storm. But you pulled the door open. I still don't know how, and you got me out." "Adrenaline," Brenda said with a small, sad smile. "And stubbornness. My mother says I inherited it from my father." "You held my face," Connor continued, the memory vivid now, playing behind his eyes. "The water was up to our chests, and the wind was screaming, and you held my face and made me look at you. You said, 'Stay with me,'" Brenda finished. "You're not alone. I promise." "You kept saying it," Connor said, "over and over, like a prayer. Until I believed you. Until the ambulance came." "And then I had to go," Brenda said. "There were other people who needed help. Other cars stranded. I wanted to stay with you to make sure you were okay, but—" "You had to save someone else," Connor said. "Because that's who you are." Brenda wiped at her eyes with the handkerchief. I tried to find you afterward. I went to the hospital where they took you, but they wouldn't tell me anything without a last name. All I knew was Connor. Just Connor. And that you worked in real estate. I searched for you too, Connor admitted. I described you to everyone. The paramedics, the police, the disaster relief volunteers. But no one knew who you were. You disappeared back into the storm like a ghost. I never forgot you though, Brenda said. Your eyes. You looked so lost, so afraid. But also so determined not to show it. Like you'd spent your whole life learning not to ask for help. Connor's jaw tightened. She'd seen through him even then. Even in the middle of a hurricane, drowning, terrified, she'd seen the truth he spent years hiding. Someone I loved betrayed me, he said, the words coming easier than he expected. About 6 months before the hurricane. I thought we were building a future together. I thought. He stopped, the old wound still tender. She left me for someone with more money. Said it with such casual honesty, like love was just another transaction where someone had outbid me. Brenda's expression softened with recognition and pain. That's why you agreed to this marriage. A contract felt safer than trust. Exactly, Connor said. No risk of betrayal if there's no expectation of love. But it's also no possibility of connection, Brenda said quietly. Connor looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman who had appeared twice in his life when he needed saving, at the strength in her eyes despite the tears, at the courage it must have taken to walk down that aisle today, knowing she was trading herself for her community. I was wrong, he said, about contracts being safer, about love being a liability, about all of it. Brenda's breath hitched. Connor, let me finish, he said gently. Please. She nodded. When I signed that marriage contract, I thought I was protecting myself, building walls, making sure no one could hurt me again. But standing there today, watching you lift your veil, seeing your face, his voice cracked slightly. It wasn't safety I felt. It was recognition. It was the universe giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What did you lose? Brenda whispered. Hope, Connor said simply. The belief that people can be good without wanting something in return. That sacrifice and compassion still exist. That maybe I deserve to be saved, not just from drowning, but from becoming someone I don't recognize. Brenda's tears fell freely now, but she was smiling through them. You looked so lost, she repeated. You looked exactly how I felt. What do you mean? When my father died, Brenda said, her voice shaking, I felt like I was drowning too. Like the weight of his legacy, of the community's need, of my mother's grief. It was all pulling me under. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see a way forward. And then your uncle's lawyers came with their offer, and I thought. You thought it was a lifeline, Connor finished. I thought it was a sacrifice, Brenda corrected. I thought I was trading myself for something greater. My freedom for my community. My future for my father's legacy. But, Connor prompted, hearing the unspoken word. Brenda looked up at him, and in her eyes Connor saw everything she wasn't saying. Fear and hope and possibility all tangled together. But then I saw your name on the contract, she said. Connor Hayes. And I thought, I hoped, maybe it was the same Connor. The man from the hurricane. The man whose life I'd saved. The man who looked at me like I was the only real thing in the middle of chaos. It was me, Connor said. It is me. I know, Brenda whispered. And now I don't know what to think. What to feel. Is this fate? Is this just another transaction dressed up as destiny? Is this real? Connor said, stepping closer. I don't know what this is, but I know it's real. The way you make me feel. I haven't felt anything in 4 years. And suddenly you're here, and I'm... He stopped, searching for the right words. Alive, he finished. For the first time since I signed my heart away to a woman who didn't want it, I feel alive. Brenda's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, until her fingers touched his cheek. The same gesture she'd made in the hurricane, the same grounding touch that had pulled him back from the edge. This wasn't supposed to be real, she said, her voice barely audible. No, Connor agreed. It wasn't. They stood there, suspended in the moment, the city glittering around them like 1,000 watching eyes. The reception continued inside, music and laughter and the performance of celebration. But out here, on this terrace overlooking a bay that had nearly killed them both, something else was happening. Something neither of them had expected. Something that felt terrifyingly like a second chance. Connor! Brenda's voice was soft, uncertain. Yes. What happens now? The question echoed the one she'd asked during their first dance, but this time it carried a different weight. This time, they both knew the stakes. Connor took her hand, the one still touching his face, and held it gently. I don't know, he said honestly. The contract says we have a year. 5 appearances. Then we're free to walk away. And if we don't want to walk away? Brenda asked, the words barely a whisper. Connor's heart stuttered in his chest, a feeling he'd forgotten, a vulnerability he'd sworn never to risk again. Then we choose, he said. Not because a contract tells us to. Not because families or boards or legacies demand it. We choose because... He paused, looking for courage in her eyes. Because sometimes the person you're forced to marry turns out to be the person who was always meant to find you, he finished. Twice. Brenda's smile broke through her tears like sunrise after a storm. And in that moment, everything else, the reception, the judgment, the uncertain future, faded into background noise. All that mattered was this. 2 people who had saved each other in different ways, standing together at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful and impossibly real. The question hung in the air between them, delicate as the jasmine scent drifting from the gardens. So what do we do now? Brenda asked again, softer this time, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between them. Connor was silent for a long moment. He looked past her, out at the city he'd spent years conquering, the skyline he'd helped build, the empire he'd inherited and expanded, the legacy he'd protected at the cost of everything else. From up here, Miami looked beautiful in its geometry, its order, its predictable patterns of light and shadow. But he'd never truly lived in it. He'd only ever survived. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Protect the family legacy. Whatever it costs. 4 years, Connor had interpreted that as a command to sacrifice everything. Happiness, connection, love, on the altar of business success. But standing here with Brenda, he understood something his father had never lived long enough to teach him. Legacy wasn't just what you protected. It was what you built. And the most important things you built weren't made of steel and glass. They were made of choice. Connor turned back to Brenda, and in her eyes he saw his own fear reflected. The terror of hoping again, of believing again, of letting walls fall when walls were the only thing that had kept them standing. We choose, he said quietly. We choose what this becomes. Brenda's breath caught. What do you mean? Connor extended his hand, palm up, an offering, not a demand. An invitation, not a contract. The marriage certificate says we're husband and wife, he said. The contract says we have 1 year and 5 public appearances. But those are just words on paper. They don't define what this actually is. Brenda stared at his outstretched hand, and Connor could see the war happening behind her eyes. Trust and caution, hope and fear, the desire to reach out and the muscle memory of pulling back. "What if we fail?" she whispered. "What if we try to make this real and it falls apart? What if? What if we don't try?" Connor interrupted gently, "and spend the rest of our lives wondering what we missed?" Brenda's eyes glistened. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Connor admitted. "It's terrifying. I've spent 4 years building walls specifically to avoid feeling what I'm feeling right now. But Brenda," his voice dropped lower, more vulnerable, "I'd rather be terrified with you than safe alone." A tear slipped down Brenda's cheek, catching the city lights like a diamond. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his palm, tentative, testing, asking silent questions. Connor remained perfectly still, letting her make the choice, letting her set the pace. And then her hand slid into his, fingers intertwining with a certainty that took his breath away. "Okay," she whispered. "We choose." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of revolution. 2 people who had been forced together deciding to stay. 2 people who had every reason to protect themselves deciding to risk everything instead. Connor's thumb brushed across her knuckles, feeling the tremor there, the fear she wasn't hiding anymore. "I won't pretend this will be easy," he said. "We barely know each other. We're coming from different worlds. There will be pressure from my family, scrutiny from the board, judgment from people who think they know our story." "I know," Brenda said. "And I'm—" Connor hesitated, searching for honesty. "I'm probably going to be terrible at this. At being vulnerable. At trusting. At all the things a real marriage requires. I've spent years learning to be closed off." "I know that too," Brenda said. A small smile touched her lips. "I'm not exactly an expert either. I've spent the last 2 years in survival mode, trying to hold everything together alone. I don't know how to let someone help carry the weight." "Then we'll figure it out together," Connor said. "We have a year, according to the contract. Let's make it mean something. Not 5 appearances and goodbye. But actually," he paused, the vulnerability almost too much. "Actually getting to know each other. Actually building something real." Brenda's smile grew, genuine and beautiful. "You saved me once. Let me try to do the same." Connor shook his head. "You don't need saving, Brenda. You're the strongest person I've ever met." "Neither did you," Brenda countered. "But sometimes the strongest people are the ones who most need someone to see them. You did that 4 years ago. You let me see you when you were drowning. Let me see you now." The words hit Connor like a wave, breaking through the last of his defenses. "I'm scared," he admitted, words he hadn't spoken since he was a child. "I'm scared of needing you, of trusting you, of believing this could actually work." "Me too," Brenda whispered. "But I think sometimes the things worth having are the things that scare us most." Connor stepped closer, until only inches separated them. Close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Close enough to feel her breath. Close enough to remember what hope felt like when it was real, not just an abstract concept. "Then let's be scared together," he said. Brenda nodded, and for the first time since the veil had lifted, Connor saw her smile without shadows behind it. Not the polite smile from photographs or the brave smile she wore for her family. But something real. Something just for him. Music drifted from the reception. A slow melody, romantic and bittersweet. Through the glass doors, Connor could see guests still dancing, still performing their roles in a celebration that had become something none of them expected. "We should go back in," Brenda said, though she made no move to leave. "We should," Connor agreed, not letting go of her hand. "Together?" she asked. "Together," he confirmed. But before they moved, Connor did something that surprised even himself. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Gentle, reverent, a promise made without words. Brenda's breath hitched, her eyes widening. "What was that for?" she whispered. "For saving me," Connor said. "Twice now." "I think," Brenda said softly, "we might be saving each other." They walked back into the reception hand in hand, and something about them had changed. The guests noticed immediately. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. The whispers started again, but they felt different now. Not judgmental, but curious. Wondering. Connor led Brenda through the crowd, and this time people didn't part with hostility or calculation. They stepped aside with something closer to respect. Or perhaps recognition. The recognition of two people who had stopped pretending. His uncle appeared in their path, his expression unreadable. "Connor," he said carefully, "I think we need to." "Not tonight," Connor said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Tonight belongs to us." His uncle's eyes flickered to their joined hands, to the way Brenda stood beside Connor not as an accessory but as a partner. Something in his expression shifted, not approval exactly, but perhaps understanding. "Very well," his uncle said, stepping aside. "We'll talk on Monday." Connor nodded and continued forward. They reached the dance floor just as the band began a new song. Something slow and timeless, the kind of melody that made even cynics believe in romance. Connor turned to Brenda. "May I have this dance? Haven't we already danced?" Brenda asked, a hint of playfulness in her voice. "That was the contractual dance," Connor said. "The one for appearances and photographs. This one," he pulled her gently into his arms. "This one is because I want to." Brenda's hand found his shoulder, and they began to move, not with the careful precision of their first dance, but with something looser, more natural, as if they were learning each other's rhythm in real time. "Everyone's watching," Brenda murmured. "Let them," Connor said. "I don't care anymore." And he realized, with a shock of recognition, that it was true. The man who had spent years calculating every move, controlling every perception, managing every image. He didn't care what any of these people thought. Not his uncle, not the board, not Derek smirking from the sidelines. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the choice they'd made on the terrace. "You're smiling," Brenda observed. "Am I?" Connor asked. "Yes. It looks good on you." "I haven't smiled, really smiled, in a long time," Connor admitted. "Why now?" Brenda asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Because," Connor said, pulling her slightly closer, "for the first time in 4 years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Brenda's eyes glistened, but she was smiling too, that same unguarded smile, the one that made his heart stutter. They swayed together as the song played, as the city glittered beyond the windows, as the reception continued around them like background noise in someone else's story. "Thank you," Connor whispered, his lips close to her ear. "For what?" "For saving me." for seeing me, for choosing to stay. Brenda pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Thank you for defending me, for believing me, for being brave enough to try. The song was ending, but neither of them moved to separate. Connor thought about the contract sitting in his lawyer's office, the terms, the conditions, the careful legal language that had tried to define something undefinable. 1 year, 5 appearances, then freedom. But freedom didn't mean what he thought it meant anymore. Freedom wasn't walking away. It was choosing to stay. Connor, Brenda said as the music faded. Yes. When I walked down that aisle today, I thought I was walking toward the end of my life. Toward sacrifice and obligation and a future that wasn't mine. And now? Connor asked, his heart beating faster. Brenda's smile was soft, hopeful, real. Now I think maybe I was walking toward the beginning. The band began another song. Guests returned to their conversations. The night moved forward as nights do, relentless, inevitable, full of moments that become memories. But on the dance floor, Connor Hayes and Brenda Williams held each other like people who had been lost and then found, like people who had drowned and learned to breathe again, like people who had signed a contract for a loveless marriage and discovered something infinitely more valuable. They discovered choice. And in choosing each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, they found the thing that had been missing from both their lives. Hope. Real, terrifying, beautiful hope. The kind worth fighting for. The kind worth building a life around. Together. 3 months later, Connor woke to sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of contentment. The space that had once felt too big, too quiet, too much like a showcase and not enough like a home, it felt different now. Lived in. Warm. Real. He could hear Brenda moving in the kitchen, the soft clink of mugs, the quiet hum of a melody he didn't recognize. Small sounds that had become the new rhythm of his mornings. Connor sat up, noticing the changes that had crept into his life like spring arriving after a long winter. Brenda's architecture books were stacked on the coffee table, spines bent from use. Her favorite coffee mug, the chipped ceramic one from the community center that she refused to replace, was sitting beside his pristine designer cups. Photographs pinned to a corkboard she'd installed, her mother, kids from the center, the two of them at Vizcaya on their wedding day. Not the formal portraits. The candid shot someone had captured on the terrace. Connor and Brenda looking at each other like they discovered something neither of them had words for yet. He got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. Brenda stood at the counter in one of his old t-shirts, her hair pulled back, completely unself-conscious. When she heard him, she turned with a smile that still made his breath catch. "Good morning," she said. "I made coffee." "I can see that," Connor said, moving to stand beside her. "You're up early." "Big day," Brenda said, pouring him a cup. "Are you ready?" Connor took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers, a small touch that had become familiar but never lost its significance. "As ready as I'll ever be." Today, they were going to the Overtown Community Center. Together. It would be Connor's first time seeing the place that had changed both their lives, the legacy Brenda had sacrificed everything to protect. And he was going to propose something that would either cement their partnership or reveal how little he understood about what mattered to her. The drive to Overtown took them through neighborhoods that Miami's tourist brochures never featured. Streets where buildings wore their age like scars. Where corner stores had bars on the windows and murals on the walls. Where children played in lots that weren't quite parks, and elderly people sat on porches watching the world move past them. Connor had driven through Overtown before, Everyone in real estate had. But he'd driven through it the way people drive through places they're already planning to change, to develop, to remake in their own image. He'd never really seen it. Brenda directed him to a small building with faded yellow paint and hand-painted letters. Overtown Community Center, founded 1993. "This is it," she said quietly, pride and pain mixing in her voice. They got out of the car, and Connor took in the details. The building was older than he'd expected, humbler. The parking lot needed repaving. The windows could use updating. But the grounds were meticulously maintained. Flower beds bursting with color, a basketball court with fresh paint on the lines, a small playground where the equipment looked loved and well used. Before they could reach the door, it burst open. "Brenda!" A chorus of voices erupted as children poured out, a flood of energy and excitement. They surrounded Brenda, talking over each other, showing her drawings and report cards and gap-toothed smiles. Connor watched as Brenda knelt down, giving each child her full attention, remembering names and asking questions that showed she'd been listening all along. This was Brenda in her element, not nervous or careful or performing strength she didn't feel. Just genuinely, completely present. An older woman appeared in the doorway, and Connor recognized her immediately from the photographs. Dorothy Williams, Brenda's mother. She was smaller than he'd imagined, her hair silver, her face lined with years of care and worry. But her eyes, she had Brenda's eyes. Strong and kind and impossible to lie to. "Mama," Brenda said, standing and moving to embrace her. "This is Connor." Dorothy looked at Connor with an expression that was assessing but not unkind. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Welcome." "Mrs. Williams," Connor said, extending his hand. "Thank you for having me." Dorothy's handshake was firm despite her small stature. "Brenda speaks highly of you. That's not something I take lightly." "The feeling is mutual," Connor said honestly. Dorothy's expression softened slightly. Not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of it. "Come inside. Let me show you what your money is helping to preserve." The tour was both humbling and revelatory. Dorothy walked them through classrooms where after-school tutoring happened, past a small library with worn books organized by caring hands, into a kitchen where meals were prepared for seniors who couldn't afford groceries. She introduced Connor to volunteers who had been coming for decades, to teenagers in a job training program, to mothers attending GED classes. Every room told a story. Every person had been touched by this place in ways that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. "My husband built this with his own hands," Dorothy said as they stood in the main hall. "Not just the physical building, though he did a lot of that too. But he built a community. He built trust. He built a place where people felt safe." She turned to Connor, her gaze direct and unwavering. "When he died, I thought his dream would die with him. The banks certainly thought so. They saw an old building in a neighborhood they'd already written off. They saw a liability." "But you saw something different," Connor said. "I saw 30 years of children learning they mattered," Dorothy said. "Families finding support when nowhere else would help them. A community that society had forgotten, remembering themselves." She paused, emotion thickening her voice. "And when I couldn't save it alone, my daughter, my brave, beautiful daughter, she sacrificed her own dreams to save her father's." Connor looked at Brenda, who had moved to stand by the window, looking out at the playground where children were now playing. Her shoulders carried that familiar tension, the weight she never quite put down. "Mrs. Williams," Connor said carefully, "I need to tell you something." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. When I married Brenda, it was because I had to. A contract. A business arrangement. He saw Dorothy's expression harden slightly, and he continued quickly. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because in the past 3 months, I've learned something about what legacy actually means. He gestured around the center. My father taught me that legacy was about protecting what you inherit, building empires, maintaining control. And I spent years doing exactly that. Protecting, building, controlling. Connor moved to stand beside Brenda at the window. She glanced at him, curiosity and caution in her eyes. But Brenda showed me something different, he said. Legacy isn't just what you protect. It's what you choose to build. And the things worth building aren't always made of glass and steel. He turned back to Dorothy. Hayes Property Group wants to partner with the Overtown Community Center. Not as charity, not as a tax write-off, as an actual investment in community development. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means, Connor said, pulling out a folder from his bag, we want to fund a complete renovation and expansion. New classrooms, updated technology, a proper library, expanded programs. And we want to create a model that can be replicated in other underserved neighborhoods across Miami. He handed the folder to Dorothy, who opened it slowly. The center keeps its independence, Connor continued. Your family maintains leadership. Hayes Property Group provides funding and resources, but you make the decisions about programs and community needs. This stays your father's legacy. We're just helping it grow. Dorothy stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. When she looked up, tears glistened in her eyes. Why? She asked simply. Connor glanced at Brenda, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Because, he said, my wife taught me that real power isn't about control. It's about using what you have to lift others. And because, his voice softened, because I want to build something I can be proud of. Something that matters beyond profit margins and board meetings. He turned to face Brenda fully now. Something worthy of the person I'm learning to become. Brenda's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that real smile, the one that made his heart forget it had ever been broken. Dorothy closed the folder carefully, pressing it against her chest. My husband would have liked you, Mr. Hayes. Connor, he corrected gently. Please. Connor, Dorothy said, and this time there was warmth in it. My husband would have liked you, not because of your money, but because you're trying to use it wisely. Later, after the tour, after emotional conversations with Dorothy and phone calls to lawyers to begin the partnership paperwork, Connor and Brenda stood alone in the center's small courtyard. You didn't have to do this, Brenda said quietly. Yes, Connor said. I did. Why? She echoed her mother's question. Connor was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. 3 months ago, I stood in a boardroom and signed a contract for a loveless marriage. I thought I was protecting my father's legacy. I thought I was being responsible, practical, smart. He took Brenda's hand. But I was really just protecting myself. Keeping walls up. Making sure I never had to risk feeling anything again. And now? Brenda asked. Now, Connor said, I understand what my father was really asking me to protect. Not the company, not the empire, but the values he built it on. The belief that what we create should serve more than just ourselves. He pulled her gently closer. You've been doing that your whole life. Building, serving, sacrificing. And His voice cracked slightly. I want to be worthy of you. Of the choice we made on that terrace. Brenda's hand came up to touch his face, that familiar gesture that grounded him. You already are. I'm learning, Connor corrected. Thanks to you. They stood there in the courtyard, surrounded by the sound of children playing, of community thriving, of legacy living and breathing around them. Connor, Brenda said after a moment. Yes. Do you remember what I said on our wedding night? That I thought I was walking toward the end of my life. I remember. I was wrong, Brenda said. I wasn't walking toward an end or even a beginning. I was walking toward you. Toward us. Toward this. She gestured around the courtyard, encompassing not just the physical space but everything it represented. Community, partnership, the choice to build something meaningful together. And I know the contract says we have 9 more months, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. 9 more months before we decide if this is real or if we walk away. But Connor, I already know, Connor interrupted gently. I've known since the terrace. Known what? Brenda whispered. That I don't want to walk away, Connor said. Not in 9 months. Not ever. The contract brought us together, but what we've built, that's ours. That's real. Brenda's tears spilled over, catching the afternoon light. Are you saying? I'm saying, Connor said, that somewhere between signing a contract and standing here with you, I fell in love. With your strength, your compassion, your courage. With the way you see the world and the way you make me want to see it too. He cupped her face gently in his hands. I'm saying that you saved me twice, once from drowning in a hurricane and once from drowning in myself. And I want to spend whatever time we have continuing to save each other. Connor Hayes, Brenda said, laughing through her tears. Are you asking me to really marry you? Without the contract. Without the obligation. I'm asking, Connor said, if you'll choose me, not because you have to, but because you want to. Brenda's answer came in a kiss, soft and certain and full of promise. A kiss that tasted like tears and hope and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, Brenda whispered, I choose you. I choose us. I choose this. Even knowing I'll probably mess up? Connor asked. That I'm still learning how to be vulnerable and trust and all the things I spent years unlearning? Even then, Brenda said. Because I'm still learning too. Learning to let someone help carry the weight. Learning that sacrifice doesn't always mean suffering alone. Then we'll learn together, Connor said. Around them, the community center hummed with life, with children learning, families connecting, hope taking root in soil everyone else had deemed too damaged to grow anything beautiful. But it had grown something beautiful, just like Connor and Brenda had. 2 people who had been forced together by circumstance, who had been drowning in different ways, who had found each other twice against impossible odds, and who had chosen, actively, courageously, impossibly, to build something real from something that was supposed to be fake. Love, it turned out, didn't care about contracts. It only cared about choice. And they had chosen each other. 6 months later, Connor stood in the boardroom where it all began. The same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay, the same mahogany table, the same faces watching him with varying degrees of calculation. But everything else was different. The Overtown Community Center partnership has exceeded all projections, Connor said, clicking through the presentation. We've expanded to 3 additional neighborhoods. The model is sustainable and scalable. And more importantly, it's working. Families are thriving. Communities are strengthening. His uncle shifted in his seat. "And the Whitmore merger?" "Signed last week," Connor said. "They were impressed by our community development initiatives. Called it visionary leadership." Derek, who had been noticeably quiet since the wedding, finally spoke. "So the arranged marriage worked. The business strategy paid off." Connor looked at him steadily. "The marriage worked, but not because of strategy." He clicked to the final slide, not a graph or projection, but a photograph. Connor and Brenda at the newly renovated community center, surrounded by children and families, both of them smiling like people who had found something more valuable than any merger could provide. "I learned something this year," Connor said to the room. "Real legacy isn't what you protect. It's what you build. And the most important thing I've built isn't a property portfolio or a successful merger." He looked directly at his uncle. "It's a partnership with someone who showed me what courage and compassion actually look like. Someone who taught me that the best investments aren't in buildings, they're in people." The room was silent. Connor closed his laptop. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere more important to be." He walked out of the boardroom without waiting for dismissal, leaving behind the approval and judgment and calculation that used to define his entire world. Because Brenda was waiting at Vizcaya Gardens, the place where they'd married as strangers and chosen each other as partners. The place where everything had changed. As Connor drove through Miami's streets, past the skyline he'd helped build, past neighborhoods he was learning to serve instead of develop, past the bay that had nearly taken his life, he thought about fate and choice and the strange way the universe works. He thought about contracts that bring people together and choices that keep them there. He thought about drowning and being saved and learning to breathe again. And he thought about Brenda, his wife, his partner, his salvation, waiting for him where it all began. When he arrived at Vizcaya, she was standing in the same courtyard where they'd nearly collided months ago. The gardens glowed in late afternoon light, the bay glittering beyond. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and her smile was everything. "Ready?" she asked. "For what?" Connor asked, though he was smiling too. "For whatever comes next," Brenda said, taking his hand. Connor looked at their joined hands, no longer bound by contract, but by choice. By love that had grown in impossible soil. By two people who had been forced together and stayed because staying was the bravest thing they'd ever done. "With you," Connor said. "Always." They walked into the gardens together, leaving the past behind, carrying the present between them like something precious and hard-won. And somewhere in the distance, the city kept spinning, the bay kept glittering, and life kept moving forward. But Connor Hayes and Brenda Williams had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the person you're forced to marry is exactly the person you were meant to find. Sometimes contracts become covenants. Sometimes drowning is just learning to breathe underwater. And sometimes, just sometimes, love arrives exactly when it should. Not when you're ready, but when you're finally brave enough to choose it. The contract had brought them together. Circumstances had revealed who they were. But the choice to stay, to build something real from something forced, that was theirs alone. Sometimes the things we're pushed into become the things we choose. Sometimes love doesn't arrive when we're ready. It arrives when we're broken enough to let it in. And sometimes, the person who saves you isn't the one you expect. They're the ones who were always meant to find you. Twice. Where are you watching from? If this story touched you, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us tell more stories like this one. Stories about second chances, unexpected love, and the courage it takes to choose hope when everything tells you to protect your heart. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family. Tomorrow, we have another powerful story that will remind you why the most beautiful things in life are often the ones we never planned for. Don't miss it.